So I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our sort of closing keynote speaker for today, Joe Johnson. Joe Johnson is President's Professorial Fellow at King's College London. He's the chairman of TES Global and a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. He is a member, or was a member, of the British Parliament until 2019. He held key ministerial roles in the past three governments, including as head of the number 10 Downing Street Policy Unit and as Universities and Science Minister. Before joining Parliament, Joe Johnson was the Financial Times journalist at the Financial Times for 13 years, and he was 4 years South Asia Bureau chief based in Delhi. So he has a great affinity and understanding of India. He remains active in UK-India relations. He co-edited Reconnecting Britain and India, Ideas for an Enhanced Partnership. So thank you very much indeed for joining us, Joe. You were with us actually just over a year ago at the inaugural India Universities Forum in Noida. The theme there was India's journey to global prominence. It's fair to say, even then, before the global pandemic hit, before the world ground to a bit of a halt, you were quite open and frank about some of the barriers that India faced to gaining that global prominence. Obviously, it's been an incredibly long year, an incredibly eventful, seismic year. And one of the things I think that's been really powerful in terms of the last 12 months, despite all the massive challenges the world's faced, is that India's produced what's been described, I think, as the most ambitious education reform policy in almost 4 decades, the NEP. Hugely ambitious, incredibly exciting. But I wondered if you could perhaps describe how significant the NEP is, what is at stake here in terms of India's future, and then we'll go into some detail shortly. But this is huge, is that right? Is it fair to say that this is one of the most important reforms we will see in recent memory for India?
Sure. Well, Phil, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me back. It was great to be with you last year in Noida at Amity, and what a difficult year it's been for everybody, including for policymakers in India. And it is remarkable that in a year in which government departments have been grappling with the sort of unexpected challenges of a global pandemic, that Minister Pokhriyal and the Prime Minister and the government in Delhi have managed to produce this extraordinarily ambitious reform initiative in the national education policy. As you say, it is staggering in its scope and in its ambition. And, you know, as even the sort of fiercest critics of the government have acknowledged, I'm thinking of, you know, the likes of Pratap Banu Mehta, the eminent academic and columnist and commentator. Even Pratap Banu Mehta has acknowledged that if this government just implements the policies in this new national education policy, the future will belong to India. So it addresses so many of the fundamental blocks in the way of India fulfilling its potential as a country today. You know, education has really been holding India back, as we heard Simon Marginson yesterday express very eloquently. India's been punching below its weight in this domain, and India's education system has suffered, I think, from a fatal combination of low levels of public spending at less than 4% of GDP, combined with very high degree of political interference and politicization. That fatal double whammy, as sort of funding goes down, interference goes up, and that's not what you want for an education system. This national education policy is of huge importance, therefore, for India, because it gives it a real chance at unlocking its demographic dividend. Now, we've heard for many, many decades about how the demographic dividend was going to come to India's benefit as its young population entered the labor market and powered growth and powered the country's economy forward. Of course, that potential was always, there were always difficulties in realizing that potential because of the shortcomings in India's social infrastructure, its schools, its hospitals, its health system, and as well obviously as its physical infrastructure and its airports, its roads, its transport communications, and so on. This national education policy represents a major commitment to addressing some of the gaps in this social infrastructure. And that's why it's a really important document for India. Of course, everything rests on it actually being implemented, and we can come on to some of those challenges later. So anyway, it's of huge importance to India, but much more than that, because of India's huge size, population of whatever it is, 1.3, 1.4 billion, shortly to overtake China to become the world's most populous country. It matters tremendously to the world. I mean, we're not going to achieve our sustainable development goals globally unless India makes progress with us. Therefore, the success of the NEP matters in Washington, it matters in Tokyo, it matters in Brussels, London, and everywhere. We all need this policy to succeed. We all need India to step up and become exactly what it's aiming to become, which is a global knowledge superpower.
Thank you, Joe. That's it is really quite profound what's at stake here. I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on the risks, and again, I think we'll talk about specific implementation in a moment, but the risks of it not being implemented. What might India's future be if we can't turn this extraordinary demographic dividend and make sure that the youth population is actually, educated, productive, and that India is a knowledge society? What happens? What are the risks and concerns nationally? And particularly if this isn't implemented, and of course the knock-on effects that you've mentioned for the rest of the world, given this India's such a huge prominence as the largest global democracy.
Yeah, I think the dangers would be, suboptimal outcomes for hundreds of millions of young people entering the workforce inadequately prepared for the challenges that they're going to face to stay gainfully employed during their working lives. So poorer outcomes, slower growth for India, a slower level of economic and social development for the country as a whole, which would, of course, prevent India from playing its full part on the world stage as a sort of a beacon of, hopefully, of democracy in a region that's troubled by authoritarian governments and military juntas left and right. India has a great role to play, but that will be all the harder if it doesn't have to support it an educated, civic-minded population that's had the benefit of really strong education through early years, primary, secondary, and an increasing proportion through to higher education. That's why if we need this demographic dividend. India needs it, the region needs it, and the world needs it, because the risk is that if we don't get it, we'll have a more volatile India, one that's more susceptible to instability, corruption, all the malaise that you get when you have a vast young population unable to find its way in a globalized economy. And that would be a real problem, and that would turn the demographic dividend into a demographic disaster, and that's got to be avoided.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a huge aspect there around focusing India, and I think the fact this policy is a consequence of very wide consultation, really clear thought across the nation. It feels like there's great momentum, so the stakes are so high. Let's reflect a bit on the actual specifics then. Obviously, there's underpinning this is educating at the sort of K-12 level, but we're focusing on higher education today. There's lots and lots of eye-catching aspects to the higher education policies, policies that I think other countries would actually envy, credit accumulation and transfer. That's something that we've been talking about for a long time in the UK. It hasn't quite ever been implemented. The importance of multidisciplinary study, building the research base. Perhaps we'll set aside the international bit until slightly later in this conversation, but what sort of strikes you are the most eye-catching and transformative policies regarding universities and the higher education system?
Well, I think to start with, it's a very honest assessment of the strengths and weakness of India's current education system. And it rightly acknowledges that the policies regarding higher education, which we can come on to in a second, are almost irrelevant unless you can get the building blocks in place correctly, properly, earlier on in the mandatory part of the educational system. That's why there's such a strong emphasis in the national education policy on the early years, with the creation of a new 5+3+3+4 structure, such an emphasis on achieving universal literacy and numeracy by 2025 as a heartbeat away, on lowering the pupil-teacher ratio, particularly in disadvantaged areas, on tackling these terrible dropout rates that are one of the greatest weaknesses of the Indian education system, that such a high proportion of school kids drop out, particularly after grade 8. And also critically providing vocational pathways at all stages, so that school kids who aren't necessarily going to take that completely academic path can get some vocational experience at every stage in their educational journey. So those are all really important sort of preconditions for India having a high-performing education system, and for being competitive on the international stage in higher education. And I think, when I was reading through the document and discussing it with the minister the other week, what excited me about it was some of the cultural changes that he wanted to see happen in Indian education, to change the way schools teach and kids learn. So he's really got this drive, this impressive drive to change the sort of the coaching culture, the cramming culture. And he wants to do that by reducing the size of the curriculum and encouraging much more free inquiry and reducing the amount of rote learning. He admirably, I think, wants to downplay the role of the current exam system, which he feels is creating this pressure for sort of coaching and excessive sort of swatting, and move to a system whereby, India has a system that is more formative rather than summative in its assessment, and tests higher order skills, analysis, critical thinking, and conceptual clarity. And all of these are really much, much needed changes. Now, turning to the higher education side of the story, and obviously for an international audience, this is probably going to be the aspect of the NEP that's of greatest interest. I think the first thing that's worth saying is that there are very strong endorsement of the role that higher education, universities included, can play or must play in India's path to development and higher productivity. So whereas in some countries, I'm thinking perhaps of the UK right now, there's a move to reduce the position and the status that universities have relative to other parts of our tertiary system. In India, the government is walking towards universities, wants to see them as part of the solution, wants to see them, for example, enroll 50% of young people in higher education, just as the UK is moving away from those targets. And I think that's a really important sort of embrace of this sector. Obviously, it brings incredible challenges. Doubling the proportion of young people, sort of 18 to 23, going through higher education in the space of 14 years, from an enrollment ratio of 26% now to 50% by 2035, is a very, very big challenge. And the government is proposing a number of different reforms along the way. It's going to be a very different kind of higher education sector if Minister Pokhriyal implements his national education policy. At the moment, it's an incredibly fragmented sector, and with about 1,000 universities and 40,000 small colleges. He envisages real agglomeration of capacity, so a clustering of knowledge hubs, as he's calling them, with universities and colleges getting together to provide real centers of excellence. And also he sees scope for expansion of those centers of excellence. So that's going to be one of the ways in which the country creates additional capacity. It's by bringing these sort of subscale institutions offering sometimes very poor quality provision into multidisciplinary hubs that can be allowed to expand to provide seat capacity for this expected surge in demand. But another way is going to be to open the doors to outside providers. And we can come on to the part that potentially the foreign universities and foreign institutions can play in providing that additional capacity that's going to be required in India. I think part of his vision, which I also found exciting, Phil, was that he wants to see much more flexible provision in higher education. So, as you mentioned, in the UK, we've been talking about the creation of a credit transfer system, a credit accumulation and transfer system for many, many years, but have failed to implement it. In India, Minister Pokhriyal is saying that his new law, which he's going to put forward before the Indian Parliament, will create a new academic bank of credit. This is an exciting idea. So this will basically be the clearinghouse for credit accumulated by students. And they will be able to dip in and out of study and transfer credits from one institution to another as they build up their qualifications. This is an incredibly exciting vision. And if India can put something like this in place, it will actually be taking a lead on the global stage if it can do it and make this kind of system work. A massively ambitious project. It's going to require a big piece of primary legislation with the creation of a giant new regulator, the Higher Education Commission of India, as well as a new research body. And I know from my own experience of taking through these jumbo bits of legislation, creating new higher education regulators and new research bodies, so we did it in the UK when we created the Office for Students, and UKRI, our own research body. They are big and controversial pieces of legislation, and he will have to invest a massive amount of energy to get it through Parliament in the shape he wants.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the credits accumulation and transfer aspect to me is so forward thinking, in the sense that we're preparing for an extremely uncertain economy before the pandemic struck, in terms of how technology is going to be changing the nature of the workplace and changing the types of roles and jobs people have. So that idea of lifelong learning, building up a bank, the idea of being as flexible as possible, particularly in driving forward improved access and equal access to people whose circumstances may challenge them. I think that's a fantastically exciting aspect of the reform, and I think the whole world is watching that. Perhaps we could reflect now on what might be more eye-catching for the rest of the world, which is the internationalization aspects. The world rankings data has persistently shown India is a very, very inward-looking sector, which is ironic because so many great Indian scholars are making extraordinary progress around the world, but there's clearly a bit of a brain drain. But the sector itself isn't collaborating internationally particularly effectively, certainly isn't attracting international faculty and talent into the sector, and isn't really particularly competitive in attracting students. Obviously, huge numbers of Indian students leave India for their study abroad. There's a package of measures really here in the NEP to tackle that. Could you perhaps reflect a little bit about those reforms, and do they, to use last year's title of the event, are they now going to lead India to global prominence? Can we actually see Indian branch campuses abroad? Will we see great universities moving into India, setting up branch campuses, collaborating more closely with Indian institutions? Yeah,
India is certainly, for the time being, punching well below its weight as a player in international education. There's absolutely no doubt about that. It attracts around 50,000 students to study in India every year. They're mostly drawn from its near neighborhood, largest number coming from countries like Nepal and Bhutan, for example. So it's not yet appealing to a global audience of potential international students. Whether branch campuses by Indian institutions overseas can find a market, I think remains to be seen. Certainly, the big brands that India has, the IITs and the IISs, I think would have a good chance of having a competitive offer to an international market if they did set up overseas. I can certainly see that. This reform again raises the potential for foreign universities to set up and establish in India. And, you know, I have a sense of deja vu, because when I was based in India 13, 14 years ago, the Congress government of that time, Congress-led administration of that time, brought forward a bill promising to do pretty much the same thing back in 2007. That bill foundered and never really went anywhere, partly because foreign institutions didn't really rise to the bait at that time. The surrounding conditions that were attached to this liberalization of the sector and this purported opening up were actually still pretty prohibitive. There were requirements about securing land, which was very, very difficult, requirements around the status, the corporate status of the institution, the amount of financial capital that had to be held in escrow to underpin the financial security of the undertaking and so on. Anyway, there was a sort of proliferation of regulatory red tape, which, whilst each individual measure might have been reasonable and defensible, in aggregate ended up sort of deterring everybody. And this bill really didn't have any final end customers, as it were. There was little point in a government trying to ram it through Parliament if in the final analysis, it wasn't actually going to result in real provision arriving. And I think that is the real challenge now facing Minister Pokhriyal, is how can he get the right regulatory environment to encourage institutions to put their brands and their reputations at risk without fearing that they're going to get ensnared in a nightmarish world of red tape, and also, even worse, the potential risks to their brands for academic integrity, academic freedom, and institutional autonomy. Those are almost much more valuable to the top 100 institutions that the Minister and the Prime Minister are targeting as potential entrants in the system than anything else. And I think it's the climate around academic freedom right now in India, which I think is probably the biggest barrier of all to potential entrance into the Indian system.
Yeah, I think the ambition is wonderful. The implementation is going to be an extraordinary journey. We have time to turn to some audience questions. It's good to see the audience are asking plenty of questions. One just on that theme actually is with a specific nod to Britain and your role there. Of course, how can British universities work with Indian institutions and the Indian government to help deliver NEP? Do you think there are specific good opportunities for UK-India relations to be driving support for the NEP, the universities getting engaged?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the strongest features of the UK-India relationship today is in the academic collaborations that we have between the UK and India. They've been mediated very successfully by a funding program and a research collaboration program called UK-EARI, UK-India Research and Innovation. And that's a very successful program run by the British Council and through our respective governments. And that has really done some great work and great collaboration. And there are other great science collaborations being supported by the Newton Fund and the Global Challenges Research Fund. Individual universities can also play a big part by encouraging academics to set up research ties with their Indian counterparts. As to whether branch campuses make sense, that's for individual institutions to evaluate. I'm sure there will be some who will be looking hard at it. As to whether there are any in that, of the 18 or so who make up the UK's contribution to the top 100, I'm not sure whether they are the likeliest candidates for that kind of overseas branch campus. I think it's more likely that it will be institutions outside of that sort of group of 18 who largely are sort of Oxford and Cambridge and assorted Russell Group members. I'd be surprised if they were the first to make that leap to having branch campuses in India.
Yeah, I think that's probably a challenge, that the bar's been set very high, hasn't it? That the government suggested it's top 100 universities they want in India, but obviously the rankings are driven by particular metrics around research strength, research power. There might be all sorts of interesting institutions or pockets of excellence in universities that perhaps will be excluded. So that bar is quite high, I think, isn't it, in terms of opening up and really encouraging that inward investment from international institutions. We've got very little time and a couple of more questions. I'll just perhaps squeeze a few more in. One is probably slightly too big for this conversation in some respect, but focusing on the digital divide, the fact that NEP won't be successful until we address the inequalities around access to the internet, access to the hardware and the software for learning. Is there anything in the NEP or in government thinking that really is going to address that in a way that builds the right foundations for success here?
Yeah, I mean, the digital divide exists all over the world, and it's still very acute in India, just as it has been troubling in the UK in recent months. But in India, even of those enrolled in higher education, a third don't have access to the internet. In rural areas where rates of participation in higher education are lowest, internet access is still very patchy indeed. 65% of people have no access at all. So of course there are real challenges around how you expand a higher education system equitably in that kind of situation, and that's going to require parallel enabling investment in India's physical infrastructure to ensure that the access to higher education is more equitable over the coming years.
And one final question I think we might just have time for, although it's again another rather challenging one, is around if India globalizes, is there a risk of dissolving the uniqueness of regional specific talent? I think that the sort of multiculturalism of India, the real diversity within the nation, is that something that might be dissolved or compromised by NEP?
Look, I don't really see that as the main risk in the NEP today. I think the foreign universities and foreign and international influences on India are going to be marginal in the difference that they can make to India's success or not. They can have a sort of a demonstrative effect of showing different types of best practice, which Indian institutions may or may not wish to borrow from, depending on their individual circumstances. They can have that sort of, they can spread best practice, perhaps. But as Simon Marginson was arguing very compellingly yesterday, the reality is India is going to solve India's problems. And the contribution that institutions from overseas, whether they're in the top 100 universities around the world or not, is going to make are going to be, of really secondary or tertiary relevance. The crucial thing is that India follows through on its commitment to increase the proportion of GDP that it's spending on education from 4% or less than 4% at the moment to a much higher proportion that the NEP is targeting of around 6%. That the kinds of reforms which the NEP is discussing around changing the curriculum, putting in place systems of assessment that take away some of the burden of rote learning from students and encourage more higher order skills and critical thinking and analytical capacity and curiosity about the world. They're going to be the really truly valuable changes, and they're going to come about from cultural changes within the Indian education system itself.
Yeah, absolutely. We've run out of time. I think there's only really time for me to say a massive thank you to you, Joe, for sharing your time. And actually, it's a really, really good way of wrapping up the 2-day forum, because it's focusing on the huge potential, the great sense of optimism, and then the challenges that we all have to now grapple with to go and work together to implement this extraordinary set of changes and this amazing opportunity. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks.
Thank you.